This January marks the 35th anniversary of the release of the American hostages who were held for 444 days in the U.S. Embassy in Iran. Up next, on History Bookshelf, David Harris, author of The Crisis, discusses politics in Iran at the time of the revolution, the Shah's exile, the revolutionary leader Ayatollah Khomheini, and the steps taken by the Carter administration to handle the hostage crisis. The Capitola Book Cafe in Capitola, California hosted this 1-hour and 15-minute event in 2004.
It's okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be back at the Capitola Book Cafe. I've had a number of pleasant experiences here before, and I'm glad to be back here for The Crisis. This is my 9th book, whoops. Is the microphone on?
Yeah.
Well, maybe I should.
You can go ahead and turn up the volume.
Is that better? Yeah, okay. Let me try and get this so I can. As you know, I'm here for The Crisis. The Shah, the President, the Prophet, and the Shah, 1979, and the Coming of Militant Islam. And I chose this as a subject, I suppose, because of my own kind of private theory about how the body politic operates. I think when we as a whole people have an experience, that experience, as certainly as shocking as the one that I chronicle in this book, tends to be absorbed by us, and particularly in our culture with this 30-second attention span, it quickly kind of translates into an implicit posture we take towards whole subjects. And very quickly in that process, we lose track of where that posture came from, that it was once an experience, and instead it becomes a kind of given that we just proceed onward with without ever any kind of full understanding of what brought us to this point and the way we see the world. And certainly in that context, one of the great contributions that history has to make, certainly to the operations of democracy, is that by revisiting these kinds of moments and these formative experiences in our body politic, suddenly we get to re-experience them again, which gives us the only possibility for beginning to shift those postures. If we can't understand the experience that led us to those postures, then we are stuck with them and they become permanent aspects of our culture. And certainly today, in the world that we're all living in after September 11th, it's a time when trying to understand ourselves in that part of the world is at the top of all of our agendas, and ought to be, and continue to be. And the first requirement, if we're going to understand ourselves there, is at least to know our own history. And in that history between the United States and Islam, there is no more central event than those events of 1978, 1979, 1980 that I have chronicled here. This was the place where the template for our modern present tense is rooted. This is the first head-on collision between the United States and militant Islam. This is an episode at the end of which both countries involved were left with governments they might never have had otherwise. The United States itself was jogged off onto a course far more belligerent than the one it had started this episode in. This was the moment when suddenly Iran and its clergy became identified with each other. This was the introduction of Islamic politics to the rest of the world. All of those themes that continue to swirl around us today began back at this point. And if we're going to make sense out of our position today, I think we're going to have to look back at this and try and understand at least what happened to us in the process. If we don't, then I think we are stuck with a kind of antagonism that will only get worse. And so with that in mind, I decided to revisit that episode. And to make this book, I used first a whole set of first-person interviews conducted all around the United States with veterans of the Carter administration and veterans of this crisis. Interviews with a number of the Iranian players who are currently in exile in Paris, and then a visit to Iran itself, where I interviewed a number of the students who were involved in seizing the American embassy, which was the incident, of course, that was at the heart of this crisis, and a number of other players inside the country of Iran. And during that process visited the old American embassy. I was told by the Iranians I was the first American to visit the embassy since it had been seized. I'm not sure if I believed that or not, but it certainly sounded nice when they told it to me. In any case, those first-person accounts were interwoven with a huge pile of documentation that is now available, including most of the files of the United States Embassy when it was captured, including the internal correspondence between the embassy and the State Department, and then the internal State Department deliberations during the course of the crisis itself. On top of that, I used a legion of contemporary accounts that were available. Remember, this was the #1 news story in the world for the entire 444 days. The American hostages and the American embassy were held by the Islamic students following the line of the Imam, as the group that seized the embassy was known. So there was a huge amount of contemporary reporting. On top of that, an equally large number of memoirs written by participants in this, and other accounts that came out in the immediate aftermath of this incident. And I tried to put all those together in a story. I do not write analysis. I write stories. And I think it is in the process of the story that we really can find the roots that we're looking for. Not simply trying to draw conclusions for a story we don't remember, but rather to go back and have the story itself. And that story is an incredibly compelling one. Let me just remind you of it at the start here. It's a story that I began telling in the fall of 1978. At that point, the government of Iran is the Shah, a royalty that was truly a leader and ruler. He was the most absolute power in the world to be vested in any one single person. He not only ran Iran, he ran its oil industry as well, and it was the second largest oil producer in the world. In the fall of 1978, he was facing an uprising the likes of which had never been seen in Iran before, and perhaps never seen in the world. This is an uprising that used simply the power of numbers of people going out in the streets, making their objection known to ultimately cut the legs out from under the Shah's rule. The response of the Shah to this, and the United States, who were his backers, he was considered to be the best friend we had on the Persian Gulf in those days, was extreme indecision. The Shah himself could not figure out how to respond to the uprising against him, vacillating between wanting to use the iron fist, as he called it, and wanting to be beloved by his people, and therefore unable to bring himself to have them shot down in the streets as a matter of policy. The United States' indecision was largely a function of the conflicts inside the Carter administration, where the National Security Council on the one hand and the State Department on the other hand could not agree about how to respond. The State Department wanted the Shah to liberalize his regime and so co-opt the revolution. The NSC wanted the Shah to crack down and use the military to establish a military government and seize control. In any case, despite all that ambivalence, the uprising continued. And let me just read you one short excerpt here that will give you a sense of what that uprising looked like. This is about a demonstration that happened on Ashura, which in the Shiite Muslim religion is the holiest day of the year. It falls in 10 days into a month of fasting, and is usually celebrated by public whippings of oneself and expressions of extreme grief. And was the demonstration on Ashura in 1978 was kind of the high point of the uprising against the Shah, involving more than 1 million people out in the streets. At 2 in the afternoon, the line down Shah Reza Avenue stretched for almost 4 miles. Both that day's crowd in Tehran and the next day's were estimated by the American embassy at several 100,000, though other estimates were well over 1 million. Altogether, throughout the country on those 2 days, the aggregate marching crowds were estimated as large as 8 million. Iran had never seen anything like it before. They seemed an endless mass, punctuated everywhere by the black sashes of chadors and occasional portraits of Khomheini held overhead. There were rumors that the Shah planned to attack the line of march with helicopter gunships, but the marchers came anyway. There were rumors that the Shah would use poison gas on them, but they were undeterred, and some even brought their entire families. Most of them believed the Shah had killed more than 60,000 demonstrators since the first martyrs in Qum last January, but they fell into line anyway. They chanted that His Imperial Majesty's twin sister was a whore, that he and his father were bastards, that Islam would never be free until the Shah was run out of the country on a rail, but they attacked no one and nothing, and, quote, extraordinary demonstration of discipline, according to the CIA. When they reached the towering 4-foot fluted columns of the Shayyad Monument, built by the Shah to commemorate 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy, the crowd spread into the open spaces around it. Then all 1 million together chanted, "Death to the American cur," and "With Allah's help, we will kill the impious traitor." That is the uprising. And the uprising succeeds by January of 1979. At that point, under the fig leaf of the Shah taking a vacation, he leaves Iran for the last time and spends the rest of his life in exile. In the meantime, Iran itself is in chaos. There is no central authority. There is a revolution going on, but most justice is being dispensed on street corners. There's a provisional government established, but it struggles to maintain order. It does succeed in holding a public referendum early that spring, in which 98% of Iran's eligible voters voted, and about 97% of them voting to install a government that was an Islamic republic, although no one yet knew what an Islamic republic was, and set out then afterwards to write a constitution that would officially set up a government. In the meantime, of course, the chaos continued, and the Shah was in exile. The Shah left Iran first to Egypt. He had been invited to come to the United States immediately upon leaving, but had decided to stay in the region in hopes that perhaps his fate might be reversed and that he might be called back to Iran, as had happened once 25 years earlier when he had taken absolute power in the first place. That did not happen. First he stayed in Egypt for a while, then he moved to Morocco until the King of Morocco, who was his host, asked him if he would please leave because he was becoming a political problem to the king. At that point, he announced to the Americans that he wanted to come to the United States. He was ready to come now. By that point, the American government, looking at the disorder in Iran and looking at the possible response of the Iranians should they take the Shah into the United States, said it would be better for the United States if you don't come into the country, and basically withdrew its invitation at that point. The Shah was left flailing around looking for some place to go. He eventually ends up in the Bahamas. The Bahamas gives him a temporary visa, but when the visa runs out, they refuse to renew it, and he then goes from the Bahamas to Mexico. In Mexico, a secret that he has been keeping for the previous 5 years suddenly begins to emerge, which is that the Shah is a very sick man. Since 1974, he had discovered a lymphoma that had caused swelling in his spleen and was having it secretly treated with chemotherapy. He refused to go to a hospital for it because if he did, he knew word of his illness would get out to his political enemies. He refused to let that happen. Even when he was in exile, he refused to go to be hospitalized. But by the time he got to Mexico, his condition was becoming worse and worse. And a decision was made to ask the United States to admit him for medical treatment for his illness. And that decision, or that request, was immediately forwarded to the embassy in Tehran to ask what the embassy thought would be the response in Iran should the Shah be admitted. And the embassy responded that if the Shah was admitted, that there was no way that they could guarantee the safety of the embassy, that the possibility of it being overrun and taken was a large one. And it had already, in fact, happened once, which most of us in this country didn't pay much attention to when it happened. But on Valentine's Day of that year, a group of leftist guerrillas had assaulted the embassy with automatic weapons, invaded the Chancery building where all the main offices were, and captured all the American diplomats there. After about 2 hours, they were run off by the forces loyal to the provisional government. But that possibility had been hanging over the Americans' heads ever since. So while most of us who experienced that experienced it as a great surprise when it happened, it was not a surprise in policy circles. This had been a possibility that was out there on the books for a long time. In fact, at the meeting where the decision to actually admit the Shah of the United States was taken, it was raised by President Carter himself. This is an account of that meeting, or take an excerpt from that account. Vance, who was, of course, the Secretary of State at the time, Vance, however, was completely convinced and switched sides on the question at the President's October 19th Friday foreign policy breakfast. The Secretary of State's defection left Jimmy Carter the only remaining member of his administration who still did not want the Shah into the United States. The President's frustration at being isolated on the issue grew steadily as the breakfast progressed. Finally, he told Vance to double-check the medical information. He also instructed Vance to inform the provisional government that the United States was admitting the Shah for medical treatment and ascertain their reaction. Then he would make the final decision. With the issue dealt with for the moment, Jimmy Carter looked around the table at his advisors. He didn't like being ganged up on, and it showed in his sardonic flash of teeth. "What are you guys going to advise me to do if they overrun our embassy and take our people hostage?" Carter asked. No one in the room made a response. After noting the silence, Jimmy Carter spoke up again. "On that day," he predicted, "we will all sit here with long, drawn white faces and realize we have been had." And, of course, within 2 weeks of making that decision, that's exactly what happened. At first, during those 2 weeks, it seemed like the worst was not going to happen. They expected a great Iranian response. The Iranian response was milder than that, more diffuse than that. They began to think they were going to get off free, and then they ran into the Islamic students following the line of the Imam, which was an ad hoc group that had been formed by a group of students who had been active in the Islamic Revolution and continued to be. Interestingly enough, they never expected that the crisis that they were going to set off would have the dimensions it did. Their original plan assumed that they would be able to perhaps hold the American embassy for 48 hours, maybe 72. But after that, they expected that they would be evicted, but they would use that 72 hours to make their point about the United States. Their point, quite simply, was that they thought the United States was preparing to reinstall the Shah, which is why the Shah had gone to the United States in the first place. The reason they felt that way was because 25 years earlier, in 1953, the Shah had gone into exile and then returned with a military coup that had been organized by the American Central Intelligence Agency and overthrew his the people who were challenging him in the government and assumed absolute rule. They expected another replay, and that this was they were going to take this action in order to alert the rest of the Iranian people. Well, what happened instead was that this seized the imagination of Iran, the same way it seized the imagination of the United States. If you remember that time in the United States, overwhelming interest in this, to say the least. Within a week of the takeover of the American embassy and the seizure of the hostages, more than 90% of Americans were telling the pollsters that they knew about what was going on at the embassy and that they were really pissed off about it. In Iran, which largely out of our view as Americans because of the isolation we have from that culture, the same response was happening. People flowed out of the countryside to surround the embassy. At times, the crowds there spontaneously were more than 100,000 people. Delegations of workers from the countryside sent groups to meet with the students. They became the epicenter of Iranian politics overnight. And at that point, the notion that they were only going to stay 72 hours was abandoned, and they decided to stay in for the long haul and use this as leverage to maintain the purity of the Islamic revolution that they were trying to wage. Now, the United States, in response, floundered trying to find someone to talk to negotiate to get the hostages back. Iran, however, was still very much in chaos. The Constitution was almost written, but not yet approved. There was yet no genuine government. The provisional government fell with the seizure of the embassy. So the Americans, having refused to talk to the Iranians previously, a year earlier when they had the opportunity, now could find no Iranians to talk to. And in the whole course of the 444 days, there were only 2 direct meetings between any representative of the American government and any representative of the Iranian government. And those 2 meetings were between Hamilton Jordan, who you may remember was the chief presidential aide and chief of staff, and the political genius who had been ascribed the architect's role in making Jimmy Carter president in the first place, between Jordan and Sadegh Khotbzadeh, who was at the time the foreign minister of Iraq in the provisional government, of Iran in the provisional government. And Khotbzadeh had initiated the contact through 2 French men, one attorney and one businessman, who were friends of his from his days as exile in Paris, and he used them as intermediaries to contact Jordan and to set up these meetings. And let me just read to you the first encounter between Jordan and Khotbzadeh. Jordan, interpreter in tow, arrived in Paris by the Concorde on Saturday morning. He did this complete with a kit with false mustache and hat and wig and stuff that had been provided him by the CIA, so no one would know that he was in fact over there on secret business. The meeting was scheduled for late that evening in Hector Villalon's luxurious Paris apartment. Jordan waited there for almost 2 hours before Khotbzadeh arrived after midnight. The Iranian foreign minister was in Paris on an official ministry junket. Hector ushered the 2 men into a mahogany-lined dining room where place settings faced each other across a table. The room was candlelit. Sadegh Khotbzadeh and Hamilton Jordan then shared what Jordan described as a leisurely dinner. Altogether, their talk lasted 3.5 hours. Jordan began by expressing his appreciation for the contact. He knew how risky it was, because at this time it had been any direct contact with the Americans was forbidden by the Ayatollah Khomheini. He knew how risky it was, but he couldn't resist asking just what would happen if this meeting were known about back in Iran. Sadegh smiled. He would lose his job at least, he joked. Maybe his head, too. Both men laughed. Those negotiations, after numerous twists and turns, finally collapsed in April of 1980. And at that point, the United States attempted its one military action of the crisis. It had been for the previous 4 months training a group of Delta Force commandos to take part in a mission in which they would be ferried into Iran in great secrecy, hidden inside Iran overnight, and on the following day they would assault the embassy, get the American hostages back, and fly them out in a rescue mission which they hoped would look like the Israelis at Entebbe, which was at that time the standard for such operations. Instead, of course, they only got through the first stage of the rescue mission, which was to fly all these troopers into the Iranian desert, where they would meet up with some C-130s, which would be hauling fuel. They would refuel and then fly to Tehran. That meeting place, which was called Desert One, which was a huge empty alkali flat out in the eastern part of Iran, the mission quickly came apart. They had to fly 8 helicopters in from the Persian Gulf because they couldn't get any closer than that. And along the way, 3 of those helicopters malfunctioned. They were left without enough helicopters to finish the mission, so they had to abort the mission. And in the process of turning around to get ready to go home and refueling, they had an accident in the refueling process. One of the planes and one of the tankers and one of the helicopters went up in flames, and 8 Americans were burned to death, and the rest of the mission fled home. And all that totally out of the awareness of the Iranians. The Iranians never knew that the mission had even happened until after the Americans came back and announced that they had done this. What ensued after that was 4 months of no contact whatsoever. That having played its trump card and lost, the Americans simply sat back until the fall of that year. And at that point, we're in the throes of a presidential election campaign when Ronald Reagan was the Republican challenger and Jimmy Carter was the Democratic incumbent. In that September, suddenly they got a contact from Iran, an emissary who had no official position but had the bona fides as an direct emissary from the Ayatollah Khomheini, made contact through the Germans and started a series of negotiations with Warren Christopher, who was at that point the Assistant Secretary of State. In the middle of those negotiations, when they felt they were only days away from getting a hostage release, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran, and all bets were off. Suddenly, Iran was convulsed in defending itself against the Iraqis. They blamed the Americans for the assault the Iraqis had made, and the negotiations fell apart. They resumed about a month after that, some 3 days before the American election, when the Iranian parliament passed a series of 4 points, which they said would be the basis for finally returning the hostages to the United States. All the basic points were to get the United States to pledge not to attack Iran, get the United States to return Iranian assets in exchange for releasing the prisoners that they had been holding. And that release of that document was kind of the last hope for the Carter campaign that they might be able to solve this, or at least announce the solution of this before the election. This hostage crisis was the determining factor in the election, and the race to try and get it done before the election happened was enormous. And let me read to you now about the moment that came in. Carter at the time had been campaigning in Chicago, got word that the Iranians had passed this, and flew back to Washington to deal with it. As always, Carter was ferried to the White House from Andrews Air Force Base in a helicopter that landed on the South Lawn. Brzezinski and Mondale were waiting for him on the grass, and Zabig immediately handed Carter the full translated text of the Majlis resolution, the first time he had seen it. The television news cameras caught the president striding with a serious face across the lawn for the White House, preoccupied with reading the document as he walked. Quote, "Very commander-in-chief looking," one of the watching journalists observed. Carter and his advisors immediately assembled in the cabinet room. By that point, the president had read enough of the two-page Majlis document to make up his mind. Until that time, Carter remembered, I had hoped that we could reach an agreement in principle, with details to be worked out later. That would have permitted the hostage release before November 4th, but that was unrealistic. Much of the new language in the Iranians' 4 points was over the top. The Majlis terms called for the president to annul any court decisions encumbering Iran's assets, to grant Iran immunity from any other American legal actions, either public or private, and to seize, quote, the assets of the cursed Shah, close quote, all of which abrogated the United States Constitution and were hence out of the question. Carter told the group in the cabinet room that although there was very likely the basis for a negotiated settlement in the Majlis document, there were still significant differences to be worked out, too major to allow them to resolve the crisis today or tomorrow or the next day. No one said anything, Ham Jordan remembered, but every single person in that room knew that at that moment that the hostages would not be free by Election Day. Certainly they weren't, and Carter was swept away in the greatest electoral defeat of the last half of the 20th century. But that did not, of course, stop this issue. It still continued to play itself out, and Carter still continued desperately as the lame duck president to try and negotiate an end to this. Eventually, negotiations resumed using Algerians as intermediaries, and a solution was found, and the hostages were released on the day that Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency and Jimmy Carter left it. It is a testament to the antagonism that the Iranians felt and still feel towards Jimmy Carter, that they did not want to release anybody while they were still on Carter's watch. It was a kind of last in-your-face for someone that they had a great distaste for. But needless to say, they were released. And let me just read you a little bit about that exit. At that time, all the hostages had been moved from where they were being held in one of Tehran's prisons over to a former palace of one of the members of the royal family, where they were all kept together. Virtually all of them were kept together, except for 6 who were being held over at the embassy. Then all of them were loaded onto buses and driven to the Tehran airport. The captive diplomats' trip through the city was eerie. As air raid protection, this because the Iraqis had been making air raids on Tehran during all this, all buildings and street lamps were entirely blacked out, so the ride was like sailing through ink. The bus never stopped on its way to the airport, an unheard of phenomenon at any hour in ordinary Tehran traffic. Once there, it was driven out to a spot at the far end of the tarmac, perhaps 30 yards from the Algerian airliners, and parked. We sat there at the airport motionless for what must have been 30 minutes, Embassy Budget Officer Bruce German recalled. Maybe more. I don't know how long for sure, but it seemed like a long time. The goons were waiting until it was 12 noon in Washington so that Carter would no longer be president. That meant it would have been 8:30 at night in Iran. So they were waiting for the official word that Reagan had in fact been sworn in before they said, let's move him. Several who peeked out from under their blindfolds could see the student guards just standing there, looking at their watches. When the word to disembark eventually came, it was sudden. One by one, the captives were guided to the door of the bus, where the blindfolds were pulled off without warning, and they were shoved into the glare of movie lights. The students were filming them one last time as they emerged. To reach the waiting Algerian airliner, the hostages were forced to run a gauntlet of some 60 or 70 students, all shouting Margbar America over and over with great ferocity. This was no ritual, Barry Rosen remembered, but an expression of fury. I had never heard these chants laced with more venom. Some of the Americans were jostled or spat upon during their walk between the rows of Iranians. One captive communications officer went through the line shouting Margbar Khomheini and flipping the students the bird. They were shouting right back at me, he remembered, and spitting and swinging at me. And that was how this episode ends, on that note. And we continue to live with it today in lots of various forms. But certainly as we sit in 2004 and see the American government eyeing the Iranian government and the Iranian government eyeing the American government, and both of them locked in antagonism, and both of them still incommunicado. There has been no direct communication since Ham Jordan's last meeting with Sadegh Hotspedeh. Ham Jordan has long since left the government. Sadegh Hotspedeh was executed more than 2 decades ago, and still the Americans and the Iranians are not talking to each other. And I think perhaps it's time for all of us to figure out just what happened between us way back when, so that maybe we can talk about it in that front. It's never too late. So let me, at this point, take your questions or answers if you got them. Remember, we're asking people to do the mic. I know it's a pain, but...
It's a little awkward, but they need to
Hi. My perception for the last 24 years was that the October surprise consisted of the Republicans making a better deal to the Iranians than the Carter administration. Am I correct about that? And I have one other question. What about the timing of the Iraq invasion of Iran? To what extent did the Carter administration or have to do with that?
Well, both those questions are kind of up in the air. The answers to them are, anyway. And on the first one, the issue of whether the Republicans cut a separate deal with the Iranians to ensure that the hostages would not be released before Carter had been defeated at the polls. It's certainly been out there for a long time. There were a whole spate of books in the early 1980s or late 1980s, 2 of which were called October Surprise. They were all about this possibility. All those charges that were made during that period were then investigated in a congressional investigation. And virtually all the evidence, most of which was second and third hand to begin with, was pretty much undercut. So there still remains no solid evidence that, in fact, the deal that supposedly happened. I can tell you that the Iranians believed that it had happened. I interviewed Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, who is now in exile in Paris, who was the first elected president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Bani Sadr says that in the summer of 1980, he was approached by some mullahs, one of whom was a relative of Khomheini's, who said that they had just met with the American Republican Party in Madrid, and that the Republicans wanted to cut a deal, and did Bani Sadr want to be part of the deal? And Bani Sadr didn't want to be part of the deal and was never included in it, never heard any more about it. But that was enough to convince him that, in fact, the Islamic Republican Party, which was the party of the mullahs in Iranian politics, and the American Republican Party had cut some kind of deal. Sadegh Hotspedeh, when he resigned from the foreign ministry in August of 1980, submitted a public letter in which one of the things he claimed was that the Islamic Republican Party had cut a deal with the American Republican Party, and which he denounced at the time. Neither of them have any documentary proof about it, and so it's one of those things that's going to sit out there as a possibility. Certainly, there is a kind of circumstantial case. The Republican campaign, as you may remember, was being managed by Bill Casey, who later became the head of the CIA and the architect of the Contra War and all the scandals that ensued out of that. So it was a man who was certainly used to playing outside of the rules. And in another episode in that campaign, there was a concrete example of them doing that, which is Casey paid someone who had stolen the briefing books for the presidential campaign that Carter was going to use. They bought a purloined copy of those and used them to prepare Reagan for the debates. So in the one debate that happened in that presidential campaign, the Republicans knew everything that Carter was going to say ahead of time, and used that against him. So that's what we know about that aspect of it. And in terms of the Iran-Iraq war, again, the Iranians believed that the Americans were behind it. I had several Iranian sources when I was in Iran tell me that there was a meeting between Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security director, and Saddam Hussein immediately before the invasion. This meeting was supposed to have happened there in the Middle East. Some versions had it happening in Jordan, some had it happening in Iraq. Brzezinski denies that completely, and the White House logs of his behavior and presence confirm his story. There is no evidence that Brzezinski was anywhere out of the country when supposedly that would have happened. That said, none of that convinced the Iranians, who were still sure that the Americans must have at least winked at this possibility, even though Carter denounced it immediately when it happened. So again, what we have here is an ongoing mystery, but the subtext of which continues to, at least on the Iranian side, play a significant role.
Well, part of your story is how much they hated Carter. Why did they hate Carter so much?
Well, first, there was a generalized antagonism toward the Americans, which comes out of 1953, when we installed the Shah in power. At which point prior to 1953, the Shah had been holding the throne since 1941, but for most of that, Iran had been occupied by the British Army, and he was just kind of a figurehead figure. Then after the British withdrew, they set up a kind of patchwork government that had the Shah having certain powers and a parliament having certain powers and a elected prime minister having certain powers, and it was a kind of fledgling democracy, if you will. In 1952, a man named Mossadegh, who was the prime minister, led the Iranian parliament to nationalize the Iranian oil industry, at which point the Americans decided Mossadegh was a communist and had to be dealt with accordingly, and arranged a coup in which the Shah was installed in absolute power. So there was that, and then all the abuses that followed. The first piece of American foreign aid to Iran during that period was to help them organize Savak, their secret police, which later tortured tens or hundreds of thousands of Iranians and enforced the Shah's iron rule. So there was that generalized resentment of the Americans. The American government that had had the most to do with the Shah and was closest to him was the Nixon-Kissinger regimes, when they had made the decision to use the Shah as the American military surrogate along the Persian Gulf, because in the aftermath of in the last stages of the Vietnam War and its immediate aftermath, America simply didn't have the military power to project out there as they wanted to. So instead they cut a deal with the Shah and gave him, the only such government in the entire world to be given these kind of rights, gave him the right to buy anything in the American arsenal he wanted short of atomic weapons. And in fact, when Cyrus Vance became Secretary of State and first looked at this document to discover, was totally shocked. And the first item of business he did with the Iranians was to get them to voluntarily withdraw from this agreement and go back to a more customary pattern of military purchases from the United States. But even under those terms, we're talking billions of dollars that the Shah was spending on American weaponry during that regime. Carter inherited that and immediately adopted human rights as his foreign policy, and almost just as immediately made the Shah one of the exceptions to that, because he was helping keep down oil prices, they thought, and because he was the military surrogate they felt that they had to have because he was on the border with the Soviet Union. Carter himself, however, was, for the first year of his presidency, looked upon by the Iranians as a potential hope, that because of his talk about human rights, that he would be the guy that might put the leverage on the Shah and force him to get up off people's necks. Then Carter bought into it in a way that was an extraordinary mistake. The Shah visited the United States in the fall of 1977 in a White House visit that was greeted by demonstrators across the street who ended up in a riot with each other, and tear gas was fired. A whole scene happened outside the White House, and that was their first contact. Then after that, Carter decided that he was ready to travel abroad, his first travels abroad as a president, and quickly put together a itinerary that had him going around the Middle East. And they found on their schedule that they had sort of 24 blank hours on New Year's Eve and the early New Year's Day that they had when they were between, I think, Poland and Saudi Arabia or something. So they had to figure out some place to stop during that. And they asked Carter, where do you want to stop? And Carter said, well, let me ask Rosalind, the First Lady. And Rosalind had quite liked the Shah and the Shah Banu, who was the Shah's wife, when they had visited that November. So she says, let's visit the Shah. So on New Year's Eve of 1977, Carter flies in for a 24-hour visit to Tehran. And his great, I'll read you that moment when Carter blows it. Let me, oops, where is it? And what sabotaged it for Carter was his natural proclivity as a Southern politician for exaggeration. And, that he couldn't say, oh, we're good friends. It was always, oh, we're great friends, or we're the greatest of friends. It was that knack for exaggeration, which is, a kind of, to him, a rhetorical device that's an expression of affection and humor. But in a place like Tehran, where every statement by the American president is parsed and reparsed and reparsed, it's a risky proposition. And Jordan, in fact, had lectured Carter on several occasions, to hold this impulse in check. Instead, Carter goes to a state dinner that night on New Year's Eve and makes a toast to the Shah. When the time came for toasts, the Shah began by welcoming his distinguished guest. His remarks were short, all to the effect that in Persian tradition it is believed that the first guest of the new year is an omen for the year to come. And just pause for a second and set the scene outside. 8 days after Carter leaves, the Iranian Revolution begins. The demonstration that is used to date the beginning of the Iranian Revolution happened 8 days after this scene. This was, of course, far truer than anyone there might have imagined. Then Carter got up and cut loose. He said he was just going to say a few words, but the toast ended up longer than that. Iran, he told the crowd, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you. As we sat together this afternoon, I was profoundly impressed again, not only with your wisdom and your judgment and your sensitivity and insight, but also with the close compatibility that we found between us. And, Jimmy added for emphasis, there is no leader with whom I have a deeper sense of personal gratitude and personal friendship. When what Carter had said about the Shah at the palace reached the Iranian streets, it stunned some, outraged others. All expectations were dashed. Henceforth, Carter and the Shah would be treated as two of a kind. On the morning of January 1st, 1978, Carter and the Shah drove back between the ranks of armed troops to the airport. Up the side streets behind the cordon and out of view, youngsters threw stones at the back of the soldiers and shouted Allah Akbar before being chased away. So that was the incident that kind of sealed Carter in the minds of the Iranians. Henceforth, he was treated as no different. And still to this day, I was amazed when I visited the American Embassy, or the old American Embassy, which is now under the administration of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And I in the course of it, got into casual conversation with these Revolutionary Guards. And this was right after Carter had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And one of these Revolutionary Guards says to me, "Well, what do you think of Carter being given the Peace Prize?" You know, and trying not to cut across them any more than I had to, I said, "Well, if they give it to Henry Kissinger, they can give it to anybody." But whereas Carter, in the years since, has become a kind of beloved figure as the most active American ex-president, in Iran, there are still people with extraordinary hard feelings toward him, simply all dating from that visit he made on the spur of the moment because Rosalind liked the Shah.
I remember vividly when Mr. Neal interviewed the Ayatollah Khomheini, I believe, in Paris before he was going back to Tehran, and he was predicting the downfall of the Shah. And I always wondered why the Shah allowed him to enter Iran. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, he allowed Khomeini to.
Yeah.
Well, he never allowed Khomeini to re-enter Iran. He exiled Khomeini 14 years earlier, and for most of that exile, Khomeini was in Iraq, in the town of Najaf, which we've all become familiar with in the last couple of years, where he would be visited regularly by pilgrims from Iran, and had a great religious influence there, operating out of the shrine to the first imam, which is the gold dome shrine that was at issue during much of the American fighting in Najaf, and had been set up there for most of his 14-year exile. Then the Shah approached Saddam Hussein, sent a secret emissary to Saddam Hussein, and asked him to expel the Shah. Saddam said, well, he would expel him if that's what they wanted, but if they'd like to have the guy done in, they'd do that too, And the Shah said, no, he would be worse as a martyr than if we just exile him, and he wanted him out of the region so he couldn't have this flow of religious pilgrims coming under his influence all the time. And the Shah's idea was, let's drive him to the West, where he'll become an irrelevant figure, a joke in Western eyes, and will lose contact and become a nothing. In fact, when Khomeini was exiled or was kicked out of Iraq and had no place to go except to Paris, and flew to Paris, on that day the Shah called the American ambassador in and told him that to just watch and see. He said, this guy will disappear from view and amount to nothing now that he's stripped of being in the region. In fact, of course, he was there at the center of a modern communication system that put him in better touch with what was going on in Iran than he had been when he was next door in Iraq. And eventually he returned to Iran from there. But when he returned from Iran, it was after the Shah had left. And his return was a phenomenal event. The correspondent from Le Monde at the time, who I spent a long interview with in Paris, remembers that the crowd that greeted Khomeini when his plane landed at the airport was, he estimated, 10 million, which, of course, is like having Greater Chicago and Los Angeles all gathered for a demonstration, but it gives you some sense of the arithmetic going on inside Iran, and just what an extraordinarily popular figure Khomeini was. It's one of the things that we missed, or we never quite got, that what a respected figure this guy was, but extraordinary. He was both the supreme political figure and the supreme religious figure, all combined into one. And so that people not only were getting political liberation from him, they were also getting a kind of personal religious salvation by his presence, and was instrumental. Without him, it's impossible to imagine there being an Islamic Republic. But the Shah, people went to the Shah and said, talk to the French, get them to kick him out of Paris. But again, the Shah couldn't bring himself to do that, worried that the option would be worse, and it was hard for him to deal with the kind of Western sympathy that existed for Khomeini, simply because he was so Western himself as well. That it felt like a kind of impossibility to him that the sophisticated West would not see through this guy, at least in his terms.
I have a short follow-on to my question about the timing of the Iran-Iraq war. In view of how prejudicial it was to the Carter administration negotiations that were going on through Germany, is it possible that Brzezinski and Carter were actually in the clear, and that the CIA arranged it independent of the Carter administration? And who was the head of the CIA at that time?
Well, Stansfield Turner was head of the CIA at that time, former admiral, who was very unpopular inside the CIA because of the limits he had put on the agency, and he had been cleaning house and kicked a number of people out. So I find it highly unlikely that this was a rogue CIA operation. CIA was in the middle of a big backpedal anyway. This is barely several years after the head of the CIA was up on charges of misleading Congress, and this was an institution in disarray. I doubt if they would have had the capacity, and I think far more likely was that Saddam Hussein simply thought he had easy pickings. Here was Iran that had been wrapped up in chaos for at least a year. The military had disintegrated in many ways, and they seemed to be sitting there basically defenseless. Saddam believed that within 3 days of his invasion of Iran, that his troops would be in Tehran, and in fact, he even he paid the airfare of a number of international journalists and brought them all to Iraq and brought them out to the border and said, hang around, I'll see you next week in Tehran. And of course, they never got any further than they got in the first 2 weeks of action. And they were faced in what may be an object lesson for those of us who talk about regime change in the region. They greeted the possibility of this regime change at the hands of Saddam Hussein with extraordinary fervor. Basically, the Iranians repelled the Iraqis with human wave assaults by largely untrained boys chanting religious slogans and carrying AK-47s, and fought a war for almost 10 years on that basis, in which each side had casualties of close to 1 million. An extraordinary piece of carnage that looked a lot like World War I. And the Iranians, unlike the Iraqis, who are a nation basically by virtue of some British overseer who sat down with a map and traced a line out and said, this will be the nation of Iraq, the Iranians have been a nation for a whole lot longer than most Americans can count. We're talking about one of the oldest civilization. We're talking about the civilization that gave the first declaration of human rights to the world. We're 2,500 years the Persians have been a culture, and they are very proud of themselves. They don't like being pushed around. They don't like foreigners giving them orders. And that response to American hegemony was obvious during this crisis, and will be obvious in any further crisis that ensues around the country of Iran.
I wanted to ask about the hostage rescue operation, the Desert One. To what extent was that controlled by or executed by the military as a bad operation, or to what extent was it interfered with by the Carter administration and that they took decisions on that? And basically why they thought it had a chance of succeeding and why they went ahead with it?
There wasn't much White House interference with this operation. In fact, Charlie Beckwith, Colonel Charlie Beckwith, who was the commander of the operation, made a point of praising Carter for the way that he just decided to do it and let the military handle it. So that Carter's own experience as a military officer, I think, influenced him greatly at that. And Beckwith said he had never had a better kind of command operation than the one he had on that. So there wasn't a whole lot of political interference. I think they thought it could succeed because they were used to assuming that they would succeed, because they had a basic picture of the American capacity to extend its power everywhere that didn't quite match up to reality. They, in fact, were playing a game on the edge of the technical capabilities of the day. To get this operation underway, they had to make a 8-hour cross-country helicopter flight through 2 sandstorms at a time when the technology, when simply making an 8-hour helicopter flight was itself an achievement in aviation. This was not some kind of standard procedure operation. None of the pilots involved had ever flown that kind of distance in a helicopter under those kind of circumstances, with radio silence and flying through two sandstorms along the way. This was out at the very edge. They had miscalculated the number of helicopters, obviously. They should have flown more than they did. But they also there were decisions made along the way that may have been unwise in terms of ruling some of those helicopters out of the operation. For example, there was a system on the Sea Stallion helicopters which were used in the raid that is supposed to give you advance warning of potential cracks in the rotor blade before any cracks show up. Now, in the history of this helicopter at the time, there had been some 40 incidents where that light had gone off, and none of them in the subsequent examinations had they ever found a crack in the blade. But the Navy regulations were, when the light goes on, you've got X amount of time before you have to abandon the helicopter. So that helicopter was abandoned. Another helicopter lost some of its guidance system along the way and turned back, or had to put down and was abandoned, and then the crew went on with another helicopter. And unfortunately, that helicopter had all the hydraulic repair equipment in it, so that when they got to the Desert One and they had just enough, 6 helicopters, just enough to go on with the mission, one of the helicopters discovered it had a faulty hydraulic pump, and the replacement part was back there in the desert somewhere abandoned. So, in the discussions inside the Carter administration about whether to do this, Vance, of course, was the dissenter, and eventually Vance resigned over this before the mission. Secretly before the mission. His resignation was announced after the mission, but in his argument, having been a kind of lifetime public servant, if you will, who had served in the Defense Department in the Johnson administration, his point was in large, complicated operations, lots of things can go wrong, and they will. And in this case, whether they actually went wrong or not is an open question, because the plan was this: they were going to fly into Desert One, refuel the helicopters there, then the helicopters would fly to this abandoned quarry outside of Tehran, where everybody the helicopters would be hidden under camouflage, the Delta Force troopers would be hidden. They would wait out the day until the next nightfall, having flown in at night, and there wasn't enough time to do it all in one fell swoop, so they would have to wait it out that night. Then the next evening, there were trucks. The CIA had infiltrated several agents into Tehran, and those agents would come out to the hiding site with trucks. They would load into the back of the trucks. The trucks would go into Tehran. They would jump out at the embassy, blow a hole in the wall, come in, kill all of the Islamic students that got in their way, grab the hostages, go across the street to a soccer stadium where the helicopters would fly in, take everybody, lift them out to an air base outside of Tehran that had been abandoned, where supposedly American transports would fly in. They would abandon the helicopters there, and everybody would go out. There was only one estimate done inside the government of what the outcome would have been, which was done by the CIA in March, and their estimate was that 60% of the hostages would be killed in the operation. So whether it was a failure or not, maybe, you know, if I were one of those hostages, I suspect I would feel like that failure was a great success.
My understanding of that incident was that Mr. Carter was given the window of opportunity, given the conditions of the desert, and that the window of opportunity presented by Vance had closed by 2 weeks before he decided to go ahead with the operation, and that the fundamental flaw in the operation was when they did the landing. One of the officers, there is a complete nighttime landing in the desert, no lights, and one of the officers mistakenly went to starboard when he's supposed to go to port on takeoff, hit another plane, rotor hit one of the other planes, and the explosion ensued, and they aborted the whole mission.
Well, in terms of Carter having missed the window of opportunity, no. The timing of it, I mean, they did it when they did because the window of opportunity was shrinking. That the problem was the nights were going to start getting shorter, and if the nights got too much shorter, they wouldn't be able to do it in 2 nights. They would have to take 3 nights to do it, which was almost impossible. So the pressure to do it when they did it was there because the lunar cycle was changing and was going to make it impossible for them to pull the mission off. And in terms of what happened at Desert One, what happened was all the helicopters were there. They had made the flight there, and all the planes were there and made the flight there. And in preparation for leaving, they decided to top off the tanks of the helicopters. And the first helicopter that had arrived, who had been idling its engines ever since its arrival, needed to top off, lifted up and miscalculated and clipped the side of the airplane, set off a huge fireball.
So sand in the desert was an issue, because that's what I heard from some fellows I know who were there.
Well, the sand was
that they had a ceiling that they couldn't exceed, and that was the reason for the limited window of time, because the engines in the helicopters couldn't handle that much sand that late into the year, and that's why they limited the window itself.
Well,
that
in
wasn't
fact,
the case.
You know, at least none of that's not mentioned in any of the official reports about it, nor any of the informal, personal accounts that have been published or were shared with me. I think that certainly the sand played a big role, because that flying through that sandstorm was what disrupted all the timing of it, and may have been key in burning out some of the helicopters that were used, but. I don't think you can put it back on Carter, and the sand was not what caused that conflagration, or not what caused the mess. They were, because of the sandstorms, they were far behind schedule when they got to Desert One. So it was an open issue whether they're going to get to their hiding place when it was still dark, which might have led to them being discovered and the whole thing coming apart. But because the sandstorm had dispersed everybody, but in fact, they hadn't calculated on the sandstorms. They had briefed people that in the weather briefing that there were possibilities of sandstorms, but they had never in their training gone through training procedures of how to fly through such a sandstorm, which was not normal part of the Sea Stallion training.
My understanding was there was no training at all. That these people were all brought together from different parts of different services and had not worked together prior to that at all.
Well, they were all brought together, but they had been working together for the previous 4 months, and then they had done some practice flying in Arizona. But whether they were trained enough, it's questionable. Certainly with the pilots, and I think that was the big leap, was the notion of flying those helicopters as far as they flew them. Under the conditions that they flew them under. And the first, the helicopter flight went off, and first it ran into one sandstorm and was dispersed, and they got back together. They hit the second sandstorm, were dispersed again, so that when they came to Desert One, they were all coming in from different directions at different times. There was more than an hour between when the first one arrived And when the last one did, when the first one arrived, Beckwith, the commander, went to find the pilot who was taking a piss against the side of his airplane, and went up and basically said, how was it? And he said, you ought to take everything, turn around, go home right now. All the pilots were exhausted when they got there. It was an extraordinary flying feat to have just gotten that far. And so I think there was that overestimation, and that really cost the mission.
I think I'd like to take the last question. And if we can, let's bring it to today. And what lessons do you think that we should take from the crisis in our U.S. foreign policy towards the whole region?
Well, I think there are a lot of those lessons, and I make it a point of letting my readers conclude their own lessons, and I'll tell the story. You can conclude what you want out of it. But I think several things are at least obvious that ought to reverberate for us in the current moment. The first, of course, is that we got ourselves into this mess. Even though we look upon it as a kind of assault out of nowhere on the United States, this was the blowback from our first experiment in regime change, in establishing the Shah in the first place. So that far from being something out of our control, this was very much in our control. It was just in a time frame that our 30-second attention span doesn't allow us to calculate. But this had everything to do with who we had been in the region before this even happened. I think a second thing that we ought to remember about it is that we had advance warning. Very much reflecting what happened in 9/11, there was information that this was a possibility. We had been overrun once. The embassy told the president over and over again, whenever he inquired about bringing the Shah to the United States, that if you bring him to the United States, we may get the embassy seized. So the problem was we didn't pay attention to the advance warning. I think the third lesson is that there are political situations that are beyond military means. I mean, one of the things that made this experience so incredibly frustrating for the mass of America was our impotence. We were used to thinking of ourselves as people who could project our power wherever we wanted and control events however we wanted to, and that there are events that are beyond our control, and that dispatching weaponry or soldiers is not the end-all, be-all of answers, that there are an incredible number of political issues out there that do not get solved by military means. And this was a case study in one of them, and I think our relations with Iran today are the same kind of case study. And I think the fourth thing to remember is that in this incident, both sides were handcuffed by their own domestic politics. I mean, part of why this was so hard to work out was that both sides were so furious and so worked up. And that for us as Americans, it's important to note that we finally got a resolution to this when our own frenzy diminished to a certain degree, and we stopped trying to press the issue and force it to happen on our time frame, but let it happen on its own time frame, and that's how it got resolved. There was a political situation in Iran that had to be worked out before this could be worked out in turn. And when we came to accept that and to flow with that was when we finally were able to resolve it. So while those are kind of generalized things, I think they sound terribly familiar given events of the last few years. And I think more so, I think in specific with our relations with Iran, that in this moment when we are making demands of Iran after 25 years of not talking to them, it's important for us to remember that we cast an extraordinarily long shadow, particularly out in that part of the world, and that this shadow is a dark one for most of the people who experience it, and they do not want to be told. For us to go in now and start rattling sabers around the question of whether the Iranians are going to try and enrich uranium at a time when we have tolerated the illegal development of nuclear weapons by our allies like Pakistan and Israel, both of which have their weapons poised throughout the region, to then go to the Iranians and say you cannot develop even enriched uranium is worth re-examining from just the standpoint of how likely this is to have any kind of sympathetic ear in a place like Iran. You don't get what we want accomplished by taking orders and demanding to control the situation. The Iranians are going to insist that they are an independent country and that they get the right to make decisions, and that if the Israelis get weapons of mass destruction, why can't they have them as well? I mean, we should face up to the fact that every country in the world that's worth its salt is going to be looking for weapons of mass destruction because they provide the only leverage to keep the superpower off their back. And so I think we have a lot to learn, and I think this is a good place to start the learning. So thanks. Buy lots of books.
And all those books are 20% off for all of you tonight. The author will be behind you. Thank you. Come with me if you would. No.
Thank you.